talk. I am on a roll. I'm dominating right now. I'll take a break to celebrate that. Yeah, fifth night, fifth night, fifth talk. Not the fifth night. Many a night. Our fifth talk here. The marriage of the sardonic and the serious, poetry and the lyrics of Wet Leg and the words of Philip Larkin. I can't explain how long I've been waiting for this one particular discussion. I don't know why. It's so many reasons, but let's get to it. You know what? I cannot help but remember reading Philip Larkin for the first time. The poet Philip Larkin, for those of you who are uninformed about who Philip Larkin is. This was when I was 21 years old. I was studying in Oxford. And, after reading, Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, followed by excerpts from James Joyce's Ulysses, serious stuff, and being introduced to modernist poetry via W.B. Yeats and T.S. Eliot, the next poet we encountered was Philip fucking Larkin. And I stress the word fucking for legitimate reasons. Why? Well, I had never read anyone like Larkin in my entire life. Up until that point, poetry in my mind, it was a high-minded endeavor reserved for only the select few who had the patience and necessary acumen to address, the heightened questions that exist in a confusing, complex world, questions of existence, God or lack thereof, death, race, loss, love, war, sex, sexuality, cultural disintegration, history, ambiguity, suicide, identity, doctrine, leadership, memory, slavery, nature, sublimity, holy cow, and the unanswerable of all unanswerables. Serious shit. And then I was given Larkin's poem High Windows. And after reading one stanza, everything changed concerning my perspective on poetry. Or maybe my perspective changed concerning art in general. This poem was a serious wake-up call. Here we go. First 4 lines. When I see a couple of kids and guess he's fucking her and she's taking pills or wearing a diaphragm, I know this is paradise. Yeah, that's paradise for you. Pretty much everything I knew and thought about poetry went right out the window. That's a bad pun for a poem entitled High Windows. That was unintentional pun. At the time, I wasn't a romanticist. I'm not even actually sure when I became focused on British romantic culture. But at the time, I was 21, so I was certainly still an elitist. And I had no idea what to do with those words. Similar to hearing the band Wet Leg for the first time. The music was one thing, but the words utterly floored me in a similar fashion to reading Philip Larkin. Now, let me digress before we get into some more Larkin and eventually, one of my favorite bands the past couple of years. Now, this is an extremely long digression because I have to unpack that term I've been using so many times through so many of these talks, romanticism and romantic culture and what it means and why I was attracted to it. This is an important digression. So patience, I promise you, this will all make sense, but you gotta let me talk about myself for about 10 minutes or so. Now, as I just said, I'm not even sure when or why I decided to focus on British Romanticism. First, you must understand that when you're pursuing an advanced degree in the liberal arts, at some point, you're going to have to decide on your specialty. And the sooner, the better. So while studying at Oxford, I honestly thought I was going to focus on comparative literature. Literature from various cultures in various languages. Fyodor Dostoevsky, he was my boy at the time. I loved reading those giant freaking novels. But as an undergrad at Boston University, I took Russian as my language. And let's just say that it didn't go very well. Mainly because I had a couple things going against me. First, I was lazy AF, and I think it was a 4 day a week class at 9 a.m. And that just didn't work well with 21-year-old me. Second, the class was small, very small, maybe 8 or 9 other students. And here's the rub: every one of them already spoke Russian. Yeah, I was taking the class because I had read Notes from Underground, Crime and Punishment, and The Devils, The Brothers Karamazov, The Idiot, and even The Adolescent. I mean, no one, a lot of people read The Adolescent, but that's like the least read of Dostoevsky's novels. But I've read them all. I was taking the class because I was enthralled with Russian literature, or maybe just Dostoevsky. Nevertheless, while in college, I worked as a valet parker at a super swank bougie restaurant. And night after night, valet parking at a swank restaurant on Newberry Street, maybe the best job I ever had. You could always find me roaming the streets of Boston, with a rolled up copy of one of these novels in my back pocket as I parked Porsches, Mercedes, BMWs, and other high end cars for the Boston elite. I loved Dostoevsky, and he came everywhere with me. I know, it was very pretentious. And then I took that Russian class. And the other 8 or 9 students, I'm guessing maybe one or two of them had ever even heard of Dostoevsky. Uh, then why were they there? Simple: for the easy A. As I said, almost every one of my fellow Russian students already spoke Russian. These were mostly, Jewish kids from immigrant families from Long Island, Jersey, or Newton, Massachusetts. Don't get all excited, all of you neo-Nazi and conspiracy theorists out there. That is not a Jewish slight, but a jealousy slight, as I'm also Jewish. But my family did not come from first or second generation immigrant families speaking Russian in their homes. The thing is, while these kids grew up speaking the language, they just didn't know how to read or write it. And that's why they were in the class. Then there was me, who had never spoken a word of Russian, but just really, really liked literature. The experience of that class, I guess you could say, was slightly unnerving, as I was at a serious disadvantage. The professor kept up to the pace of the rest of the class, and I sat in back the few days that I would show up, with my mouth closed, which, as you can probably guess, is very much unlike me. Listening to myself, pronounce these words compared to the students who had been speaking Russian since early adolescence was embarrassing at best. Hence, there's a reason my GPA dropped so drastically from my sophomore year to my junior year in college. Yeah. I guess I just need to confront the reality. Maybe my language skills sucked. They still sucked. I mean, even in graduate school with French, it didn't go very well. I guess it's time just for the Babel app. Um, hmm. But in the end, with all the excuses I could come up with, it was obvious that I should probably just stick with English language literature. Even when I studied in Oxford, I was not really introduced to the Romantics or the Romantic era. It was still primarily British modernism, as I already clarified and unpacked that for you in our second discussion on Pearl Jam and Radiohead. Uh, and I guess what attracted me to both time periods was that these are two time periods that are both conscious revolts against the tradition, and it was an affront to authority, which was appealing to a 21-year-old me. Who freaking likes authority at 21? At the same time, Romanticism and modernism accepted and embraced the importance of experimentation. The modernists, much more so than the Romantics. Still, they were both about change, and change was something I was clearly attracted to. They're very much attracted to. Growing up in a fairly affluent neighborhood with a fairly affluent, suburban neighborhood and family, whatever, and seeing all my family and friends being mostly attracted to simple materialism, I was rebelling. I chose to make my profession out of the liberal arts. My mindset was, bring on that dangerous shit that Plato, was so scared of. Now, during my master's program at Ohio State, my thoughts, began to coalesce, and I guess I saw British Romanticism as a harbinger to modernism. Uh, and it was so uncomfortable. I hate bringing this up, but I'm going to. Uh, I distinctly remember one of my professors asking me about my future endeavors and what area of study I plan to focus on. And when I responded that I was still undecided, the professor, knowing that I was Jewish, recommended that I study Jewish studies. Here's a digression from my digression. WTF. All right. I mean, I did really enjoy, Saul Bellow novels, not merely because he was Jewish or that I was Jewish. That was something that I never understood in terms of intellectual pursuits. The pressure on you to identify with text narratives that connect to your own identity. It just didn't and still doesn't make logical sense in my mind. I have no problem with an African American focusing on African American literature or culture, but I also have no problem with an African American focusing on critical theory, a predominantly and traditionally white dominated subject matter. There's no doubt in my mind that Cornel West can pontificate on Derrida and Foucault with the best of them. I mentioned those French dudes before. How about a Brit focusing on American literature? Or a woman dedicating herself to the Beat Generation, probably the most male centric moment in history. Shit, people, like what you like and go with it. Remember all that stuff about my love of Dostoevsky? Well, that dude was an extreme anti Semite. All right, go back to talk number one if you want my take on cancel culture. Uh, at the same time, the fictional character that I relate to most, it's an easy question. I remember me and my grad student friends, we used to sit around and be like, which fictional character do you relate to most? Me? No, it wasn't Jay Gatsby, Raskolnikov, or Huck Finn. It's Lily Briscoe from To the Lighthouse. Yeah, a woman. Hence, do not feel pressured to dedicate yourself to a subject matter because of simple identity. On the other hand, if your identity lends itself to the narrative of a specific field and that's what you want to explore, then go with it. But don't feel pressure from any sort of, do I want to say hegemony again? Hegemony to fit a certain mold. This type of logic really reminds me of yeah, those sportscasters or sports critics. I'm sorry to give another sports metaphor, but sportscasters or sports critics who tend to know more because they actually played the sport, which is a load of crap. Listen, this sometimes is true, but just because you played the game doesn't mean that you understand the game more so than the lay person. I've heard some ex-football players who are now broadcasters, and in all honesty, they don't know what they're talking about, and their analysis sometimes tends to be horrifically skewed just because they were the ones in the arena, and so that they can spew the gospel. Yeah, in the arena. That's the problem that I have with that Teddy Roosevelt quote, that famous Teddy Roosevelt quote. It is not the critic who counts, not the man who points out how strong man stumbles or where the doer of deeds could have done them better. The credit belongs to the man who is actually in the arena, whose face is marred by dust and sweat and blood, who strives valiantly, who errs, who comes short again and again, because there is no effort without error and shortcoming, but who does actually strive to do the deeds, who knows the great enthusiasm, the great devotions, who spends himself in a worthy cause, who at best knows in the end the triumph of high achievement, and who at worst, if he fails, at least fails while daring greatly, so that his place shall never be with those cold and timid souls who neither know victory or defeat. Inspirational stuff. Listen, of course I praise the participants as much as the next person does, but participation does not equate to heightened acumen. Just because, I don't know, you've been to Paris doesn't mean you've gotten everything from French culture or maybe anything at all. It's more nuanced than that. I know some people who are more traveled than 99% of the world, and you know what they've gotten out of the experience? Absolutely nothing. Some serious White Lotus shit here, and those terrible characters on that show who are oblivious to to the world right in front of them. That's a reference to that wonderful HBO show. In the end, it's really about the particular person and their desire for awareness more than anything else. This equates to all contexts, sports, politics, business, and even academic studies. Participation is just a piece of the equation. Absorption, analysis, the ability to avoid static perspectives grounded in certainty is what truly matters. Being in the arena is not enough. Okay, let's get back to my initial digression. In the end, when I was 25 years old, I decided to focus on British Romanticism because, well, I was an egoist. Uh, man, I was an asshole. Now, that this is not a slight to the Romantics. This is simply enough of my early ignorant understanding of the culture of British Romanticism. I wasn't a bad reader at the time, but I wasn't a very sophisticated one either. You hear all about politics. You will hear all about politics in the next and final talk. However, at 25 years old, politics and historical actualities were the furthest thing from my mind. I wanted to take part in the big discussions. For me, that's what poetry was supposed to be all about. And I found this earnest subject matter in Romantic poetry more so than any historical moment or cultural movement. It flattered my ego, to be writing papers about all of this high minded stuff. Seriously, up until the 18th century, for the most part, poetry dealt with heightened subject matter, serious people, serious events, serious shit. But taking a step back, we got to consider, who was reading poetry in the mid to late 18th century. Yeah, aristocrats, white male Protestant, mostly aristocrats. And what do you think those aristocrats wanted to read about? Obviously, heightened stuff, like themselves and all the others who were attending Oxford and Cambridge. Going back to the beginning of Western civilization, poetry for the most part was a heightened subject matter, big events, important people, serious stuff. Not whether a girl is on the pill or using a diaphragm. Thank you, Philip Larkin. Now, this heightened aspect of poetry does not completely change with British Romanticism at the turn of the 19th century, but owing to the historical and political realities of the world at the time, primarily the French and the American revolutions, there was clearly a shift in perspective away from the merely elite. Now, I remember when I referenced Thomas Gray at the end of our Pearl Jam discussion from his elegy written in a country churchyard, a poem that many scholars consider to be the harbinger to British Romanticism, mainly because it pivots away from the heightened aspect of 2,000 years of the poetic tradition in favor of, the simple, the common, and the ordinary. In other words, Gray focuses on the purely mundane aspect of life. Stuff readers of poetry were not used to confronting. A rustic setting, some dead farmers, the country's landscape's other inhabitants. I don't know, some birds, an owl, a beetle, a rooster. Clearly we're no longer in the realm of, the Trojan War, Odysseus, or God versus Satan from Milton's Paradise Lost. But still, as Gray's poet speaker indicates, maybe we, the readers, need to pay attention to the things in our wake that we typically not give two shits about. And it's not the subject's fault, it's our fault for not paying attention in the first place. I keep saying that. It's our fault. It's our fault. I think I'm getting to my, maybe my thesis. As Gray writes, perhaps in this neglected spot is laid some heart once pregnant with celestial fire. The poet is referencing the tombs in an old churchyard, but not the big, bright, shiny busts and monuments, as opposed to what he finds in this neglected spot. The tiny, overgrown, corroding tombstones that are falling apart. So maybe every once in a while we should pay attention to the things, people, and places that we would typically overlook. Let me explain to you this way. Let's think about movies for a moment. All right? What movies draw the biggest crowds and make the most money? The answer is obvious. We love our big budget CGI explosions, superheroes, scantily clad ladies, and beautiful movie stars. They're bright, shiny tombstones in the context of Gray. They're easy to look at, pleasing the senses, and typically do not take too much work on our part as audience members. I say typically because I want to be fair and avoid generalizations, for the most part. On the other hand, what movies typically win awards? Not that awards in the arts really matter, but still. The answer is indie films. The films that do not have $500 million budgets, that often do not rely on stardom, that rarely utilize special effects, and that typically are more about narrative and, I don't know, acting. These movies may win the awards, but I seriously doubt the masses gather for the opening of, um, what was that movie? Birdman or The Whale, as they do for a new Marvel studio release or the latest installment of The Fast and the Fucking Furious, people. Ay, ay, ay. Um, Alas, this might be Gray's point. We, the public, are easily attracted by and typically focused on the easy to look at. What draws our attention are things that we'd expect. However, Gray's poem throws a little irony in the mix. You never know what you might find if you look at the things in the world that you typically not look at, or at least that not many other people are looking at. Subsequently, what comes with this tweaked sense of perception, with looking at the seemingly ordinary, is a different experience for us as viewers. We must be willing to see differently. Think about it. The experience of watching an indie film is quite different than watching a big budget explosion movie. You might actually have to put in a little more effort and pay a little more attention. You might have to focus on the words and how they are spoken. Um, Side note, this is not always true. Oppenheimer was a big budget movie, but that movie is driven by dialogue and acting and the writing itself. Point being, in looking at the stuff in this world that we typically not look at, we must become more active. Finding meaning in the ordinary and seemingly simplistic is not easy. At least is not as easy as finding meaning in a transformer. Now, I am not labeling indie films as ordinary or simplistic by any means. However, they are typically overlooked as being ordinary, at least in terms of dollar bills, mainly because they lack the shine of the blockbuster. But again, as Gray is urging, you never know what you're going to find until you look at that which is overlooked. Think we're getting somewhere. So, in getting back to poetry at the turn of the 18th into the 19th century, a drastic shift occurs. Poetry is no longer just reserved for the heightened subjects or people of a particular culture, but it can be about anything or anyone. A fairly democratic gesture. I brought up the French and American revolutions, for a reason. You see how all of this works, people? Mhm. I mentioned how my ego is attracted to the big questions. And while it might seem that romanticism is dumbing down the subject matter, however, nothing can be further from the truth. For the most part, romantic poetry tends to focus on seemingly simple subject matter. Yet in this case, it was more about what the human mind or imagination could do to these things. This is where we get that loaded phrase to romanticize, which sometimes means to exaggerate. But in the context of what many of these poets were doing, it's more about how showing how things in the world out there, oftentimes the natural world, could carry meaning well beyond, their just empirical existence, depending on who is doing the looking. If you think this is deep, wait till we get to my final talk. No spoilers. And this is the stuff that got to my young ego. Poetry was about, the individual imagination, exploration of the self through memory, internal investigation, the search for creative inspiration, sexy stuff. You can see why my immature self in my 20s was so sold on romanticism. Deep stuff too. Now, I think it was both the democratic gesture combined with the heightened consciousness that brought me to the British Romantics. Seriously, Romanticism is some dense stuff, much more suited for the college classroom than the farm, as Thomas Gray's elegy might posit it. That's very reductive. But yet, what many Romantic poets suggest in theory concerning poetry addressing the ordinary really comes to be seen in practice with Philip Larkin a century and a half later. All right. Um, the key difference here is that, the Romantics kind of distilled the ordinary through the imagination to show how the ordinary could become the extraordinary. For Larkin, it was showing how poetry could merely focus on the importance of the ordinary because it's ordinary. Okay, it's not just the F bombs I referenced at the beginning of this chapter from his poem High Windows, nor the amazing opening couplet of his poem This Be Thy Verse. What a great opening couplet. They fuck you up, your mom and dad. They may not mean to, but they do. Such a great opening line. Two lines, sorry. Yes, this is truly the language that human beings really use. At the same time, what must also be noted with Larkin is the sardonic tone that he brings to poetry, getting away from those elitist tendencies. This tone becomes quite clear in his poem, Church Going, where the poet speaker wanders through an old church, wondering about its irrelevancy in the future and the emptiness or hypocrisy it signifies in the presence. Yeah, I need to live up to the stereotype of the liberal English professor for my Fox News audience out there. There aren't any of you. So I might as well touch on a little atheism. Now, beyond the seemingly mundane subject matter that Larkin addresses, what is even more significant is his tone. The dude is not only sardonic, but he's funny as hell. In Church Going, his poet speaker wanders through the church pews, referring to himself as bored and uninformed as he looks at some brass and stuff before offering an Irish sixpence as a donation, a coin that at the time carried zero monetary value. If you have a sense of humor, you gotta laugh. Indeed, Larkin's poetry reflects the ordinary in both focus and feel. In so doing, I by no means think that Larkin is dismissing the ordinariness of life, but more importantly, stressing the intense earnestness of the everyday. And what better way to do so than through the guise of an ironic dismissiveness and a humorous lens? All of a sudden, we truly find poetry in a place we never suspect, in a subject matter that is anything but heightened. Bringing meaning and significance to aspects of common life that we typically never expect to equate to poetry. And the ability to laugh might be the most poetic aspect of them all. Listen, I've always prided myself on having a good sense of humor. You may laugh at some of my shit, you may not. I don't care. But I mean, reading all this serious stuff, you got to find time to laugh. I can't imagine reading this stuff without having a sense of humor. Laughter humbles us, in a sense, takes a little shine out of the ivory tower stereotype. Oh, I'm going to come back to all you ivory tower people in my final talk. But yeah, we may be writers and scholars, but we can also laugh at the scruples of what it means to be alive. We don't have to take ourselves that seriously. And through Larkin, I came to understand that we got to be able to laugh and at the absurd and mundane aspects of life. And that laughter should not only ring true, but it should ring loud. Now, pretty much everything I've just said concerning the heightened aspect of the poetic tradition translates to the world of contemporary music as well, especially in regards to the important music and the important musicians. And thinking about the tradition of contemporary popular music, and those who get canonized for whatever reason, well, there's an earnestness attached to the ethos of most of these artists. The big names are to be taken seriously because they supposedly have significant cultural relevancy that typically translates to, politics, history, and other serious subject matter, such as love. We've seen this before. Tension, relationships in general, depression, heartbreak, or mere confusion concerning existence in a complex world. Indeed, important music, must be just that. heightened. These artists are serious and need to be taken seriously in terms of both musicianship, and lyricism. The Beatles, the Stones, Led Zeppelin, Dylan, Crosby, Stills, Nash, Fleetwood Mac, Pink Floyd, Paul Simon, The Clash, The Boss, Joan and Joni, The Sex Pistols, Marvin Gaye, Aretha, the feminists I already covered, along with the big names of rap. I mean, there's even an earnestness to more performative artists, such as, Madonna, and, maybe even more playful artists, such as the Beastie Boys. I've said enough about the music coming out of Seattle in the 90s and the more avant garde indie stuff that followed with, Radiohead and similar bands. You get the point. For music to be poetic, well, it must be important and reflect this sense of high art. Like my foray into romanticism, that was initially what I used to think. But as I learned through Philip Larkin, music can also have a sardonic, playful humor that in and of itself becomes a serious subject matter. And this takes me to Wet Leg. So it was March of 2022 as I was driving my honors students back from a conference in Atlanta. One of my students turned the radio to Sirius XMU, and Wet Leg smacked me in the face, just as Larkin did so many years prior. First, the music was fun, it definitely rocked, but it still had a cool dance beat to it. As if the Strokes and Harry Styles had an offspring. There's a reason Harry chose Wet Leg as his opener for his 2023 European tour. But as much fun as I had listening to them, later that night I hit up Spotify and also looked up the lyrics that were constantly making me laugh. At that point, I had forgotten about Larkin, who I had not read or taught for years. Yet looking at the lyrics to both Chaise Longue, lounge. I don't know what Americans would probably call it a lounge. We'll call it Chaise Longue, and and their song "Wet Dream." I immediately thought about Larkin. The music was eye-opening in the best of ways, and after looking at the words, I saw something that I had not seen in some time. And yes, it was poetic. For my British listeners out there, oh God, I hope there are some of you. You don't need a refresher on this band. It took the UK by storm in 2021 and 2022. Well, not just the UK, as they also won a Grammy for Best Alternative Record of 2022, while collecting tons of Brit Awards. Not that awards mean anything, again. Followed by a stint at Coachella in 2023. I'm not sure how I feel about them playing Coachella. Still, for all of you, those of you in the dark, the band is fronted by Rhiannon Tisdale and Hester Chambers, two ladies who met while studying music on the Isle of Wight. About a decade later, the two mates, put together Wet Leg and talk about an overnight success. Their first two singles, Chaise Longue and Wet Dream, what I just mentioned, they both blew up the charts in the UK, and as they should have. Interesting side note. Pearl Jam tagged Chaise Longue at the end of their performance of Daughter during both of their 2022 and 2023 tours. But maybe what brought Wet Leg the most attention in the United States was seeing them on former President Barack Obama's summer playlist in 2022. Something, the cool ex-prez has been tweeting out, Xing out. You have to call it tweeting out. You can't call it Xing out. Tweeting out for years. Now, in listening to or reading, their interviews, it's clear that these two from Wet Leg are quite self-deprecating and even reticent when it comes to their successes. They also have a little, Jack and Meg White thing going in terms of their relationship, even suggesting that the two women are a married couple, which may just be a publicity stunt. I'm not sure. I could be wrong about this, but they're creating a kind of playful mystery around their actual lives that increases, the public spotlight vis-a-vis speculation. One I think that is consciously constructed. Yet the ladies do not seem to be overly excited or overwhelmed by their quick rise to fame. They seem to be, or at least they seemed to be, and I think probably still do, seem to be amused by all the hoopla. Well, simply enough, taking it all in stride. And they're so British. I mean, seriously, listening to their interviews, they could very well be, quirky characters, straight out of a Guy Ritchie film. Um, Consequently, their ethos translates nicely to their music. So let's get to the music. As I said, my first response was that these ladies are a hell of a lot of fun, and their lyrics reflect this reality. Now, a lot of their lyrics are sexual in nature, but by no means in the same vein as we saw with Alanis and a lot of the other third wave feminists from the 90s. I could easily focus this talk on a straightforward feminist read. And I'm not going to ignore the concepts that I previously touched on with the other female artists. However, I actually think that there's something else going on here. And though the feminist aspect will help accentuate what I have to say, it is not my primary focus. My focus is on their playfulness and the sardonic tone that they take in constructing their narratives. For instance, Chaise Longue begins with a seemingly straightforward proclamation of attending university. Pause. Go ahead, hit pause, listen to the song, read the lyrics. Now I'm going to quote some of them. Yeah, a straightforward proclamation of attending university. Mummy, daddy, look at me. I went to school and I got a degree. Simple enough, until they put a subtle twist on the wordplay. All my friends call the degree the big D. The quick reversal from degree to the big D almost comes as a shock, maybe to some. Yet the movement from shock to hilarity arrives almost immediately, as I got the big D is repeated in various iterations the next 5 lines. I got the big D, I got the big D. Education and the subsequent degree have been completely lost or replaced, and the narrative now becomes quite clear in terms of meaning. I did a lot of fucking in college. Excuse my language. No, not excuse my language. Alas, that's the hilarity involved as the reality of the situation not only becomes palatable but relatable. The university experience these days, well, for a long while actually, especially from a pop culture lens, going all the way back to Animal House, maybe, or maybe something before, who knows? It's just that. It's all about sex, or at least from a stereotypical perspective. Yeah, we gratuitously glamorize the sexual context of attending university. It's something we all relate to and all understand. We've seen it innumerable times in movies and on television, as I just mentioned. Nevertheless, if we're snickering at this first verse, the upfront tongue-in-cheek words that follow make it quite clear that we did not misread or mishear those words. Skipping over the chorus, the next 2 verses begin with almost spoken word blunt questions. Is your muffin buttered? Would you like me to butter your muffin? Along with, is your mother worried? Would you like us to assign someone to worry your mother? Okay, pause. For the younger generation out there, yeah, the butter your muffin line may be an allusion to Mean Girls from 2004. In the scene where Lindsay Lohan enters the cafeteria, and is asked this question by some boy. However, going back even further to another teen comedy, this gets to the Gen Xers like myself. The phrase was also used in John Hughes' movie Weird Science in 1985 by Bill Paxton's character, who's propositioning Kelly LeBrock's character. Either way, both comedies use the phrase in a manner that very much supports, I think, what I have to say. Now, the absurd, almost cliche reality of these questions are laughable, both in a good and a bad way. We got to first think about, where these words come from. And it seems quite plausible that these are the ridiculous inquiries of some adolescent boy, something that women most likely have to deal with all too often. As a reader, you're laughing at these words, but when you step back and think for a moment, you got to ask yourself, would someone ever actually say something so absurd? And unfortunately, the answer is Yes, especially from the perspective of a woman dealing with oversexed boys. This is the absurd reality of being a woman in the context of a world, the university, that is foundationally driven by getting laid. Seriously, women must have to hear some just ridiculous shit out of the mouths of young boys, and this lyric is laughing at that reality. For what is it that young boys in a university setting truly want? Good grades, a job, friends, an internship? Uh-uh. The answer is sex. Or as the ladies from Wet Leg put it so bluntly, what are you doing sitting down? You should be horizontal now. They're so good. Nevertheless, it is not completely clear that all of these questions are actually coming from the perspective of the male. But either way, the words, no matter who is speaking, capture the hypersexuality of a particular environment in all of its hilarity. I'm not sure I would call this satirical as opposed to parodical. As I have to explain to my students all the time, satire has a much larger social connotation dealing with social issues. While parody aims to laugh at the ridiculousness of a certain reality, kind of like, I don't know, a non believer putting a worthless Irish sixpence in a donation bowl at church. Hmm. The lyrics are not titillating, nor are they poetic in the sense of shining a light on a serious cultural issue. They are poetic because they are laughing at the reality of life, a reality that is, well, quite laughable. Uh, all day long on the chaise longue. Uh, Now, that's just one read. Another possibility is that they are, parroting our cultural's continuous tendency to slut shame. Sure, it's fine for a guy to go to school and brag about all the girls he's been with. However, for a woman to constantly brag about getting the big D, well, we tend to look down upon women who are sexually promiscuous. The hypocrisy is obvious, and they may be laughing at both scenarios. Either way, all day long on the chaise longue. Moreover, their wonderful second single, Wet Dream, picks up on similar themes, if you didn't already make that connection from the title. Uh, in general, the lyric captures, the sensation of a young woman who's being sexually objectified by someone she is not necessarily interested in. Again, in a fairly amusing manner. This aspect of the lyric is not too complex. Here's the line. Go ahead. If you didn't press pause and listen to it, read the lyrics, blah, blah, blah. Pause. Back to me. All right, here we go. I was in your wet dream, driving in your car, saw you on the side of the road. There's no one else around. This is then followed by the repetitive hook, touching yourself, touching yourself, touching yourself, making the insipid gesture on the male's part meaningless, but still pretty humorous. The important couplet, what makes you think you're good enough to think about me when you're touching yourself, signifies the objectification of the male gaze. Oh boy, go back to that Alanis discussion. Something we've seen before. As well as the feckless perspective of males in general when it comes to seeing women as mere sex objects. As previously mentioned, I see this lyric as an extension of what we already saw with Chaise Longue. It's a laughable parody of the reality of being a woman courted by immature, unaware men. Not just young men, in my opinion. The reality is that this type of ridiculous behavior by many men exists until death. And nowhere is this more clear than the pickup line offered in the lyric. Baby, do you want to come home with me? I've got Buffalo 66 on the DVD. Now, two things about this line, which is repeated twice. First, I'm fairly confident that 99% of listeners or readers have no idea what the movie this lyric is referencing, which is significant because it means so much. Second, when I first heard it, being a slight movie buff and someone who has actually seen the film, I could not stop laughing. And this plays into the significance of the reference. Let me explain. When I first got into Wet Lake, I clearly recall calling up my hipster buddy from New York, who now lives in Austin, Texas. Not surprising, he's a hipster. This is my buddy who actually introduced me to Pitchfork, Built to Spill, Modest Mouse, St. Vincent, so I knew he'd know who Wet Leg was. Our conversation centered pretty much on how cool they were and how great their music was. And then I made the following statement. Dude, they reference that terrible movie where the director filmed himself getting a blowjob from Chloe Sevigny. Yet I actually was mistaken about this, and my buddy quickly pointed out my error, noting that the infamous real blowjob movie was the director's next movie, The Brown Bunny, not Buffalo 66. Huh. All right. Buffalo 66 from 1998. And The Brown Bunny was from 2003. Were both directed by Vincent Gallo, who both stars in the film and is, like I said, the director. And yes, The Brown Bunny does include a very real scene of fellatio between the director Gallo and actress Chloe Sevigny. I actually was surprised to find that the movie holds a 47% fresh on Rotten Tomatoes, which I find to be quite inflated. Probably owing to the cult appeal that centers on the fact that the film includes a real blowjob by a fairly well-established and well-respected actress. Anyway, part of me wanted the reference in the lyric to actually be to the Brown Bunny because it's a horrifically poor movie. Either way, the use of Buffalo 66 works just as well, but not because it's a bad movie. It's actually quite good. However, put into the context of the lyric, I could not think of a worse movie to use as a pickup line than this movie. Come back to my place and watch Buffalo 66. Not only is the movie a random indie film, but is one of the most depressing and least titillating movies I have ever seen. Or dare I say, mundane. Typically, you'd think, in the most cliche manner, that a dude trying to be romantic and pick up a girl via film would invite her home to watch, I don't know, Notting Hill or Titanic. If he's trying to get a little lascivious, 9.5 Weeks or Basic Instinct. Christ, even 50 Shades of Shit. Buffalo 66 is 2 hours of snow, depression, American football, and nostalgia. There's nothing titillating about the film, nor cutesy. The stuff you'd expect from a guy trying to woo a girl. It's an outlandish choice in terms of films, and well, that's the point. It's such a striking choice of a film that there's absolutely no way that this could have been made up. No one could think to use this film in this context. It's so freaking absurd and out of left field that the reality is that someone actually had to say this. These are actual words that girls have to deal with from vapid, unaware, and feckless boys. Of course, if this did not actually happen, then the girls are using this film metaphorically, which does not change the meaning at all. In the given context of courtship, the film signifies an utterly absurd and outlandish attempt at courtship. And no, they are not good enough to think about her while touching themselves. As the lyric clarifies, it's enough to make a girl blush. And as it should. But in this case, the blushing is not out of excitement of being in an erotic situation or the embarrassment of being propositioned. The embarrassment is aimed at the person actually muttering these words. Our speaker is embarrassed that someone like this actually exists. He is embarrassing. Again, it's a hilarious lyric. Overall, it's grounded in the absurdity of real life existence. The upbeat tempo of the intro outro with its fairly insignificant words, almost as if it's some kind of cheer, offers a sense of, laughability at the entire situation. The situation that, similar to Chaise Longue, you can only laugh at. And it's an important laugh, just as we saw with Larkin's works. Poetry must be able to display the world in all of its ordinariness, and this includes the ridiculous aspects of everyday life. If poetry is a mirror of ordinary existence, well, it doesn't get any more ordinary than this. These lyrics strip away the gloss of romantic liaisons in favor of the absurd and ridiculous reality that truly exists. Now, with Wet Leg's playful, sometimes avant-garde performances, I will say more about this in a moment, it seems as if the girls are really just attempting to make us laugh, and that their art might just be for shits and giggles. Still, sometimes you don't need to intend to say anything. And consequently, you end up saying everything. And going back to what I said earlier about the earnestness of canonized musicians, along with how I initially viewed poetry. Well, with Wet Leg, this is clearly not, Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young singing Ohio, the Beatles Across the Universe, or A Day in the Life, or Aretha's Respect. Alas, I've read a lot of reviews of Wet Leg, most of them favorable. Yet one word that I saw in a couple different reviews really seemed to stick out to me, and that word is kitsch, a word that signifies a type of low art, often naive or gratuitous in terms of its execution. In the context of music, bad 80s hair metal comes to mind. And I'm thinking of, Motley Crue's Girls, 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 Warrant's Cherry Pie, or Poison's Nothing But a Good Time, or maybe anything by Poison. This art form is not only derivative vis-a-vis image and musicianship, but its lyricism is, well, let's just say lacking in substance. Maybe my favorite example of kitsch is, I don't know, Right Said Fred's I'm Too Sexy. Yeah. That's, oh boy. If you've never seen the video, just Google it. All right. Alas, as much as I love Van Halen, David Lee Roth is as kitsch as you get. And a song such as, Hot for Teacher is clearly gratuitous. And I'd argue that without the brilliant genius of Edward Van Halen's guitar work, Van Halen would be nothing more than kitsch. Edward heightens the artistry of the band on practically every level. Similarly, intentionally derivative art can be kitsch. And there's no better example right now than Greta Van Fleet. Listen, they're very talented, but are little more than a glamorized cover band. Their lyrics, well, the words are also derivative and subsequently fairly empty. T.S. Eliot's famous aphorism about good poets borrow, great poets steal doesn't really work for Greta Van Fleet. There's a big difference between using the tradition and building upon it, i.e., what the Stones and Zeppelin did with American Southern blues, as opposed to simply mimicking it. Oh boy. There are also some seriously racial implications that must be acknowledged in terms of the Stones and Zeppelin, both of whom clearly profited off of a marginalized art form and culture. With that said, I acknowledge the counterpoint as well. Without these bands, it's quite possible that American Southern blues would have remained marginalized. Though Jimi Hendrix might be the fly in the Vaseline of this argument. Now, Tom Morello borrowed from Edward Van Halen. I will continue calling him Edward out of respect, who borrowed from Hendrix and Stevie Ray Vaughan, but Morello turned the tradition into his own. You can listen to Morello and know it's him while still recognizing his influence. There is nothing singular about the music of Greta Van Fleet in terms of lyrics, image, or music, and that's what makes them kitsch. They kind of remind me of the Darkness, that band from the early 2000s, who were clearly a parody of heavy metal. However, the difference is that they were aware they were a parody. I'm not quite so sure with Greta. So moving forward, the presence of awareness might be key to understanding Wet Leg. Now, I can kind of see how some critics and listeners would dismiss Wet Leg as kitsch. However, I think they'd be mistaken. Let me once again get a little anecdotal to help explain myself, all right? My brother and my cousins, my two cousins, they fucking love Jimmy Buffett, R.I.P. For pretty much 35 years, these three relatives of mine have gone to see Buffett almost every year until his passing. But let's just say Buffett has never been my cup of tea. I got dragged to a Buffett concert by my relatives back in 2012, and the experience was, well, fairly unsatisfactory. Listen, I won't lie. My ticket got thrown away upon entry because I was frisked by security, and let's just say some contraband was found. As my brother and my cousins entered the venue in hysterics, I had to proceed back to the parking lot to find a ticket scalper and a new entrance, so I wasn't in a good mood to begin. However, once I got into the venue, the music did not help. Beyond the fact that I utterly abhor the whole parrot head ethos of his fandom, Buffett's music has always seemed to me to lack any kind of substance, or I guess you'd call it an edge, as vague as that may sound. It's the best I can come up with at the moment. Um, Hmm. I've always seen Buffett as being, simple, just a little too easy. For me, music, poetry should should have a little bit of danger involved. Back to Plato, a threat. Some kind of threat, to our way of thinking and feeling. Poetry should be threatening. Buffett, however, always seemed too innocuous for my liking. Here's a better example. Buffett's like a fried chicken finger when I tend to prefer foie gras or a good charcuterie board. All right. Nothing against chicken fingers. They have their time and place, usually when I'm hungover and need some grease. But it's not the type of meal that I would typically choose to order. Does this metaphor make sense? Okay. Anyway, as you'll see soon enough, and I'm sure this won't come as a shock by any means, I do have a certain affinity for Bob Dylan. I think he's over my shoulder. Yeah, I know. It's as cliche as it gets coming from an English professor, but what can I say? My stepfather inundated me with Dylan from an early age, well before my choice in career paths. I guess my upbringing and my professional life just coalesced in terms of my liking for Dylan. Nevertheless, I was utterly distraught a few years back when I read an article on Dylan in which he named Jimmy Buffett as one of his favorite lyricists. I could not believe what I was reading. I mean, the same dude who wrote Tangled Up in Blue and All Along the Watchtower actually liked the dude who wrote Cheeseburger in Paradise? I could not wrap my head around this incongruity. And to make matters worse, I later stumbled upon a video of Dylan from the 80s doing a cover of Jimmy Buffett's A Pirate Looks at 40. Yeah, and I listened to the cover, which wasn't terrible. It was confounding and confusing, like that time I saw Slash playing in front of 100 people 6 years after seeing him play in front of a crowd of 20,000 people. But the cover seemed to add credence to an otherwise, very, I don't know, do I want to call it a cheesy lyric? It's not that cheesy. It's not that bad. It's kind of cheesy. Um, but I guess it added credence owing to Dylan's ethos. Fuck. Art's tough. Yet, I think I've come to understand why Dylan enjoys Buffett so much. And the answer is kitsch. Yes, Dylan may like Buffett, but he doesn't like him enough to include any of his lyrics in his 2022 book, The Philosophy of Modern Song, in which Dylan goes through the lyrics of, 66 seemingly capriciously chosen songs and a kind of freewheeling form of criticism. But I can't speak for Dylan. However, he seems to appreciate the mere simplicity of the music and the lyrics, as not all art has to be high art. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with kitsch, and from time to time, just like a chicken finger, we may prefer something simple versus something complex. Buffett's easy, and up until his 70s, he was still up there having a hell of a lot of fun. That was the one thing I took away from that concert I attended in 2012, and I respect that. Is there something poetic about Buffett? Listen, I haven't gone through the pantheon of his lyrics, and I'm sure he has written some significant and important stuff. But what I've garnered from his more commercial lyrics is that it's not very complex, defamiliarizing, imagist, romantic in the academic sense, avant-garde, or culturally significant in terms of politics or history. He's a chicken finger, which sometimes tastes pretty good. And as Coleridge clarifies, sometimes poetry is more about the process and not the ultimate meaning. Hence, the pure joy of Buffett doing what he was doing till the end of his life, I would claim is quite poetic, even though it's not music, lyrically or sonically, that I'd typically turn to. I don't like all poets. Nevertheless, I do not see the lyrics of Wet Leg as being kitsch by any means. I certainly understand how some readers could see their lyrics as being gratuitous because, at first glance, the playfulness of the lyricism, along with the performative element, certainly does not suggest that this music is heightened or high art. It seems too fun, too simple, and possibly too ordinary. Yet, as we learned from Thomas Gray, the Romantics, and Philip Larkin, sometimes we should not be so quick to dismiss, and maybe we need to pay attention to the things that we typically not pay attention to. Indeed, those who think that Wet Leg are mere kitsch may actually be missing the point. The girls from Wet Leg are quite aware that what they are doing is gratuitous, sometimes absurd, strikingly sardonic, and meant to be fun and laughable. Yet Buffett is meant to be fun as well, but in terms of humor, well, I'm not quite so sure he's in on the joke. With Wet Leg, we are laughing at the hilarity of life being reflected in all of its ordinary hilarity, as we saw with church going from Philip Larkin. With kitsch, it's typically the art form itself that is laughable due to its own naivety and simplicity. What separates Chaise Longue from Cheeseburger in Paradise is consciousness of naivety, the consciousness of the naivety of the ordinariness of everyday life. The girls from Wet Leg are in on the joke. They are not the joke. Similarly, this is what we see from Philip Larkin as his poet wanders through the empty church, feeling nothing, the same way these women construct the emptiness of casual sexual relations, especially from the female perspective, which we've seen before as either grounded in passive, kind of passive softness or sometimes abrasively shocking. Wet Leg's lyrics reduce sex and sexuality, especially from the female perspective, to something laughable, or dare I say, even mundane. We get to see life unfiltered, expletives included. Art is not always so serious. And guess what? Neither is life. However, it is the awareness of this fact that results in art and life becoming poetic. Whew. Now, excuse me, I briefly mentioned the performative aspect of Wet Leg and would like to spend another minute or two on the relevance of their performances. Thinking back to a couple chapters ago, I discussed how performance can accentuate or detract from, I said chapters again. Talks. I discussed how performance can accentuate or detract from lyrical relevancy vis-a-vis Britney and Miley. I would argue that Wet Leg are the perfect example of how performance can accentuate lyricism. Excuse me again. 1 second. Dry throat. Now, if you were to look at their videos of their live performances, their 2023 live performance of Chaise Longue at the Brit Awards comes to mind. Coming from a vacuum, or if you were, from a completely naive perspective, you might be tempted to see this performance, as performance art or avant-garde. All right. However, in going back to the lyrics, we can really see how the performance accentuates the words as the visual signifies pure parody. The overtly absurd playfulness, which seemingly makes very little sense, actually is a logical visual representation of their words. It hysterically mocks the apparent heightened expectations that come with not just music, but with art in general. Visually, it's Andy Warhol, blended with David Lynch. Ugh, R.I.P. My heart hurts. But all distilled through the words of Philip Larkin. It's pop, it's absurd, and sardonic all at once. I recall a while back having difficulty explaining to a student, the difference between modernism and postmodernism. And at the end of the discussion, I arrived at the following. The key difference is that postmodernism has a conscious self-awareness and a kind of sense of humor in accord to the experimentation of modernism while still utilizing its tropes. To borrow from my man crush Seth MacFarlane and Family Guy, Wet Leg's music doesn't insist upon itself. Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. However, in Wet Leg's case, the experimentation exists in their utilization of mundane language that brings to light the hilarity and poetry of our ordinary daily lives. In a sense, art doesn't have to be heightened to be high art. And that was the romantic instinct from the beginning. Whew. That was a hell of a lot of fun, at least for me. I hope you had fun too. Sweet. Uh, what's coming next? Fun? Eh. Mind-boggling? Yeah.